Let us first discuss what international humanitarian law is. We already know that the international humanitarian law, also known as the law of the war or the law of the armed conflict, is one of the branches or bodies of international law. It is defined by the International Committee of Red Cross as a set of rules which seek for humanitarian reasons to limit the effects of armed conflict. It is the law that stipulates the way in which wars will be conducted in order to protect individual victims of war and their fundamental rights. We have to take note also that the international humanitarian law is dependent from the justifications, reasons, and prevention efforts that states have when going or preventing war. This branch of international law was rooted in the rules of the Asian civilizations and religions, since warfare has always been the subject to certain principles and customs. It is important to remember that the IHL and the International Human Rights Law are two distinct but complementary bodies of law. And although they are both concerned with the protection of life, health, and dignity of people, the IHL applies only in the armed conflict, while human rights law applies at all times, whether in peace or in war. According to the ICRC, the IHL applies in three situations. First, it is that it applies in international armed conflicts which involve at least two or more countries. Secondly, is that during the situations where the whole or part of the country's territory is occupied by a foreign power. For example, when the northern Cyprus was occupied by Turkey in the year 1974. And lastly is that when armed conflicts arise within a country between a government and one or more organized armed groups. For example, as in the case of the Philippine government that is involved in a non-international armed conflicts in southern part of the country, specifically in Mindanao. Some of the terrorist groups present in the areas are the Moro National Liberation Front or MNLF, Moro Islamic Liberation Front or the MILF, and the New People's Army or the NPA. The IHL only applies to armed conflict and it does not cover the internal tensions or disturbances. Another thing is that it applies only once a conflict has begun. And it equally applies to both sides regardless of who started the war. Our group have identified three main objectives of IHL. First is to limit the suffering caused by warfare and to alleviate its effects and restrict the means and methods of warfare. The second is that they are always after the protection of civilians, including the non-combatants, in times of warfare and ensuring that the population in affected areas are adequately catered for. And lastly is to preserve a measure of humanity even during conflicts. The principles and actors and the corresponding obligations will be discussed by Tillini.
Let's discuss what are the main principles of IHL. Basically, IHL is a compromise between the principle of military necessity and the principle of humanity. What do we mean by the principle of military necessity? It discusses that a parties to a conflict may resort its means and method of warfare only to achieve a legitimate purpose of a conflict. At the same time, the principle of humanity forbids causing unnecessary suffering or distractions that are not required to achieve the said purpose. So moving to the other principles, we have principle of distinction, proportionality, and precaution. The third principle, the principle of distinction, it's all about distinguishing between combatants, military objects, and civilians and civilian objects. So a party to a conflict may only direct attacks against military objects and combatants. That means they are not permitted to direct attacks against civilians and civilian objects. That's the idea. So moving to the principle of proportionality, it discusses that attacks should not be cause severe damages that is necessary. So to maintain the proportionality between the attack and the consequence. And also the principle of precaution. The idea of principle of precaution is to spare due care towards civilians and constant care towards civilians and their objects during an armed conflict. So it can be achieved through double-checking mechanisms, warning before a conflict, so on and so forth. So that's our summary about the principles of international humanitarian law. So moving to the next section, who are bound by international humanitarian law, or who are the parties to international humanitarian law? As we all aware, states comes to the first place. So all states, they are bound by international humanitarian law obligations, treaty obligations, as well as customary international humanitarian laws. And then we have non-state actors, such as non-state armed groups, national liberation movements, collective security operations, and individuals. It's a summary of who are parties to international humanitarian law, as well as what are the main principles of international law. Yeah, let's move to the next point.
Hello, I'd like to talk a little bit about the main sources of international law, and I'm going to separate them between treaty law and customary law. So, in terms of treaty laws, as we understand international humanitarian law today, they start with the Hague Conventions. The first one was in 1899 and the second one in 1907. And they're known as the Law of the Hague, and they govern means and methods of warfare, the conduct of hostilities, and occupation. The first convention, as a result of the first convention, there were 3 treaties and 3 additional declarations, and the second convention has 13 treaties. The second body, the second group of declarations that come to be part of international humanitarian law are the 4 Geneva Conventions of 1949. In the aftermath of Second World War, the first one protects wounded and sick soldiers on land during war. The second one, wounded, sick, and shipwrecked members of armed forces at sea. The third one, protection of prisoners of war. And the fourth, protection to civilians, including those in occupied territories. It is important to mention that all these conventions have a common article, common article number 3, and this is important because it extends the protection given by each convention to non-international conflicts. And since the second half of the 20th century, this type of conflicts have become more common than international conflicts. Well, it's a very important article. Additionally, there were other 3 protocols to the Geneva Conventions in 1977, one regarding international conflicts, the second one non-international conflicts, and the third one additional, the use of a distinctive emblem. And there are other treaties in terms of victims of armed conflict, methods and means of warfare, cultural property, criminal repression, etc. When it comes to customary international law, there are 161 rules with their regular practices. And maybe the best example is the Martins Clause that was introduced in the preamble of the 1899 Hague Convention. And this clause reads, inhabitants and belligerents remain under the protection and the rule of the laws of nations, as they result from the usages established among civilized peoples, from the laws of humanity and the dictates of public conscience. So it's pretty clear into what international humanitarian law tries to protect. Thank you.
What is the Red Cross? The Red Cross and the Red Crescent movement is the world's largest humanitarian network. Its mission is to prevent and alleviate human suffering, protect life, health, and ensure human dignity. It's present in every country and has millions of volunteers all over the world. The role of the ICRC, or the International Committee of the Red Cross, has been and continues to be fundamental for IHL. The statutes of the International Red Cross and the Red Crescent movement specify that the ICRC's role includes the following in particular. Number one is tasks incumbent upon the Geneva Conventions and application, and to work for the understanding and dissemination of knowledge of international humanitarian law, applicable in armed conflicts, and prepare any development thereof. This part is particularly important, prepare any development thereof. It's contained in Article 5, paragraph 2. It's particularly important because in order to fulfill this mandate, the ICRC prepares draft texts for submission to diplomatic conferences. A tangible example is that the first drafts of the Geneva Conventions were elaborated by the ICRC. The 4 Geneva Conventions and their additional protocols give ICRC specific mandate to act in the event of armed conflict. IHL challenges. The IHL faces constant challenges. One of them is military asymmetry or asymmetric warfare. Military asymmetry is when the means of warfare of one belligerent party surpasses its opponent significantly. In other words, it's when one state has better weapons than another one. Not only better in technological advancements, but also better in access to them and in quantity. Why is this a challenge to IHL? Because weaker parties, in order to counteract their military shortages, sometimes use civilians as human shields to protect themselves from the opponent's military. These practices, of course, increase civilian casualties and constitute an IHL violation. In some cases, weaker parties plan to get their own civilians attacked by opposing military to benefit from media coverage and portray themselves as victims in order to deter the opponent's military action. A clear example of this is in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, when Hamas, that is a military group that governs Gaza, felt outweighed in military and carried out human shield practices, which included installing military headquarters in schools next to kindergartens, or launching rockets from schoolyards, having tunnel openings near hospitals and schools. Enforcement. No law by itself, whether international or national, is capable of halting a behavior completely, especially on such a complex circumstance like war. While IHL aims to circumscribe certain behaviors in armed conflict, there will always be states and individuals who will not be deterred from violating the rules. Again, this in international law and national law. Regardless of the penalty applied, some people continue violating law. Codified and customary law isn't enough to discourage and impede IHL violations. New technologies. In the near future, wars are thought to be fought by autonomous machines, but how will belligerent parties guarantee that machines within their programming will protect civilians and non-combatants regardless of which side they're on? Thank you.